Frank Sinatra sat alone inside a parked car in Los Angeles. The windows were sealed. The engine was running. Carbon monoxide slowly filled the cabin. Just a few years earlier, he had been the biggest singer in America. His records sold millions. Crowds of screaming fans shut down entire city blocks. But now everything was gone. No record contract. No movie roles. Newspapers openly wrote that Sinatra was finished. So how did a man who nearly died in a gas-filled car return just 2 years later to win an Oscar and rebuild one of the greatest careers in entertainment history? Just a decade before that night in the car, Frank Sinatra had been the most powerful voice in American music. In the early 1940s, his concerts caused scenes that looked almost unbelievable. At the Paramount Theater in New York in 1944, thousands of teenage girls packed the streets outside. Police struggled to control the crowd. Some fans fainted. Others cried as soon as Sinatra stepped onto stage. Newspapers gave those girls a new name, Bobby Soxers. Within a few years, Sinatra became the first true pop idol in American history. His records sold in the millions. Radio stations played his songs constantly. Hollywood quickly pulled him into films, turning the skinny singer from Hoboken into a national romantic symbol. Songs like I'll Never Smile Again at Night and Day turned his voice into something almost personal for listeners. Sinatra didn't just sing melodies. He delivered every line like a quiet conversation. By the mid-1940s, he seemed untouchable, but fame at that level rarely stays stable for long. Behind the screaming crowds and bright stage lights, pressure was building. Personal scandals began appearing in newspapers. His voice started to change, and the music industry itself was shifting. Within less than 10 years, the man who had created the first wave of mass pop fandom in America would be watching his entire career collapse. How did the biggest star in American music fall so fast? Frank Sinatra was born on December 12, 1915, in Hoboken, New Jersey, a small industrial town sitting across the Hudson River from Manhattan. At the time, Hoboken was crowded with working-class immigrant families, especially Italians who had arrived in America chasing opportunity, but often found only long hours of labor and narrow tenement apartments. Sinatra's parents were part of that wave. His father, Anthony Martin Sinatra, had once been a bantamweight boxer before becoming a fireman with the Hoboken Fire Department. His mother, Natalina Dolly Sinatra, was far more formidable. She worked as a midwife, assisted women during childbirth, and quietly built influence in local political circles. In a neighborhood where power often came from reputation and alliances, Dolly Sinatra knew how to command respect. Frank was their only child. His birth itself was traumatic, the delivery was difficult, and the doctor had to use metal forceps to pull the baby out. The tool damaged his left ear and left deep scars along the side of his neck, injuries he would carry for the rest of his life. Those scars later became one of the subtle insecurities Sinatra rarely talked about publicly. Growing up, he was not the kind of boy people expected to become famous. He was skinny, quiet, and often withdrawn. School did not interest him. In fact, Sinatra lasted only a few weeks at A.J. Demarest High School before he was expelled for what teachers described as disruptive behavior. Formal education simply never fit his personality. Yet Hoboken itself was a kind of education. The streets were noisy, competitive, and unforgiving. Sinatra watched how adults argued, negotiated, and survived. His mother's strong personality also left a deep mark on him. Dolly Sinatra was not a gentle figure. She was decisive, politically active, and deeply protective of her son. Some neighbors described her as intimidating. Others called her fearless. For young Frank, she became the first example of what power looked like in the real world. It was Dolly who constantly told him he was meant for something bigger than the docks and factories surrounding Hoboken. But Sinatra's escape from that world did not come through school or sports. It came through sound. Like many American homes in the 1920s and early 1930s, the Sinatra household had a radio. And through that radio, Frank discovered voices that would shape his future. The one that affected him most was Bing Crosby. Crosby's style was radically different from the loud theatrical singers who dominated earlier decades. He sang softly, almost conversationally, as if speaking directly to the listener. Sinatra studied that sound obsessively. He listened to records repeatedly, memorizing phrasing and breathing patterns, trying to understand why Crosby's voice felt so intimate. Frank began practicing in secret, sometimes standing in front of a mirror, pretending he was already performing for an audience. He was not trained. He did not read music, but he had an unusual instinct for emotional delivery. Instead of pushing his voice loudly, he held notes gently and stretched phrases in ways that made lyrics feel personal. Even at that early stage, Sinatra understood something many singers never learned. A great vocal performance was not just about hitting the notes. It was about making the listener believe every word. Still, dreaming about music and building a life in music were two completely different things. Hoboken offered few opportunities for a young man with no formal education and no connections in the entertainment industry. Sinatra spent his late teenage years drifting between small jobs. At one point, he worked briefly as a delivery boy. At another time, he helped at local clubs. None of these jobs lasted long. His real interest always returned to singing. Whenever there was a chance to perform, even informally, Sinatra took it. By the mid-1930s, he began entering amateur talent contests in nearby towns. These competitions were small, sometimes held in theaters or dance halls where the prize might be only a few dollars or the chance to sing again the following week. Yet for Sinatra, they were the first real test. Standing on those modest stages, he began learning how audiences reacted. He discovered that when he lowered his voice instead of pushing it, people leaned forward to listen. It was a small discovery, but would later define his entire career. In 1935, Sinatra joined a local singing group called the Hoboken Four. The group entered a radio talent show called Major Beau's Amateur Hour, which was broadcast nationally. To everyone's surprise, they won. For the first time, Sinatra experienced what it felt like to hear applause from people who had never met him before. That moment was brief, but it planted a powerful idea in his mind. Maybe the boy who had been expelled from school and underestimated by most of Hoboken could build a future on stage after all. But amateur radio contests were only the first step. America's music industry was controlled by powerful band leaders and record companies, and breaking into that world required more than ambition. Sinatra was still an unknown young man with a rough background and a dream that seemed far larger than his circumstances. The real question now was whether that dream could survive the brutal realities of the professional entertainment business. After the brief excitement of the Major Beau's Amateur Hour victory, reality returned quickly. The Hoboken Four did not become stars. The group went on tour for a while, performing small shows across the country, but the success was temporary and the money was modest. Eventually, the group dissolved, and Sinatra returned to New Jersey with little to show except a growing determination. The experience had confirmed something important to him. He belonged on stage. The problem was finding a way back onto one. For the next few years, Sinatra worked wherever he could sing. One of the places that gave him steady work was a small nightclub in New Jersey called the Rustic Cabin. It was not glamorous. The club was located beside a busy highway and attracted travelers more than devoted music fans. Yet the Rustic Cabin had one advantage. It broadcast its performances on a local radio station. Every night, Sinatra stood in front of a microphone, singing to diners and passing truck drivers while his voice traveled invisibly across the region. He treated every performance seriously, even when only a handful of people were paying attention. It was during one of those broadcasts that opportunity quietly arrived. In 1939, trumpeter and bandleader Harry James happened to hear Sinatra's voice on the radio. James was in the process of forming his own orchestra after leaving the famous Benny Goodman Band. He was searching for a vocalist who could bring something fresh to his music. Sinatra's voice stood out immediately. It was not powerful in the traditional sense, but it had an emotional clarity that was difficult to ignore. Harry James invited Sinatra to join his orchestra. For Sinatra, this offer meant everything. It was his first real entrance into the professional music industry. Touring with a big band meant traveling constantly, performing in ballrooms and theaters across the country, and recording music that would reach national audiences. In July 1939, Sinatra recorded his first commercial songs with the Harry James Orchestra, including a ballad titled All or Nothing at All. At the time, The record did not become a major hit, but the recording marked the beginning of Sinatra's presence in the national music scene. Still, the Harry James Orchestra was only the first step. The larger breakthrough came the following year, when Sinatra received an even more significant invitation. Tommy Dorsey, one of the most powerful band leaders in America, wanted him as the lead singer for the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. Dorsey's band was already famous. Joining it meant performing in front of massive audiences and appearing regularly on national radio programs. Sinatra accepted immediately. The time he spent with Tommy Dorsey would shape his singing forever. Dorsey was not just a band leader. He was a technical perfectionist. As a trombone player, he was known for producing extraordinarily long, smooth musical phrases without obvious breaths. Sinatra became fascinated by that technique. He watched Dorsey closely during rehearsals and performances, studying how he controlled airflow through the instrument. Sinatra began practicing breathing exercises, tried to imitate the same fluid phrasing with his voice. The result was a singing style that sounded unlike most vocalists of the era. Instead of sharp or dramatic notes, Sinatra delivered long, flowing lines that seemed almost effortless. Listeners often described his voice as intimate, as if he were standing right beside them instead of performing on a distant stage. This approach allowed him to transform songs into emotional narratives rather than simple melodies. During his years with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, Sinatra's popularity began growing rapidly. Radio broadcasts brought his voice into homes across America, and young listeners especially responded to his gentle style. Women wrote letters to the band asking specifically about the new singer with the soft voice and the dark eyes. Sinatra was still technically part of the orchestra, but audiences were beginning to notice him as an individual star. That growing attention eventually created tension. Sinatra did not want to remain just another band vocalist. He wanted independence, creative control, and the chance to build a career under his own name. Leaving the Dorsey Orchestra, however, was risky. Big band leaders controlled the industry at the time. Walking away from one of the biggest orchestras in America could easily destroy a young singer's future. But Sinatra believed the moment had arrived. In 1942, he made the bold decision to leave Tommy Dorsey and launch a solo career. The move shocked many people inside the music business. Without the support of a powerful orchestra behind him, there was no guarantee audiences would continue paying attention. Sinatra was betting everything on his own voice and personality. Within 2 years, that gamble would turn him into the most famous singer in the country. Yet the same spotlight that lifted him to the top would eventually expose every weakness in his life. And once the fame reached its peak, the fall waiting on the other side would be far more dramatic than anyone could have imagined. By the early 1940s, Frank Sinatra's gamble had paid off in a way few people could have predicted. Once he stepped out from behind Tommy Dorsey's orchestra and began performing under his own name, his popularity exploded with astonishing speed. The timing was perfect. America was entering World War II, and the country was emotionally exhausted. Millions of young men were leaving home for military service, and families were searching for something familiar and comforting to hold on to. Sinatra's voice, soft and intimate, seemed to provide exactly that. In 1943, he signed with Columbia Records and began releasing songs that quickly spread across radio stations nationwide. Unlike the loud theatrical singers of earlier decades, Sinatra sang as if he were speaking directly to one person. That emotional closeness created a connection listeners had rarely experienced before. Songs like I'll Never Smile Again, All or Nothing at All, and Nancy with the Laughing Face became part of the national soundtrack during the war years. But the real turning point came in October 1944 at the Paramount Theater in New York City. What happened there became one of the most famous moments in early pop culture history. Sinatra was scheduled for a series of performances, and within hours the streets surrounding the theater were completely overwhelmed by fans. Thousands of teenage girls filled Times Square. Some cried uncontrollably. Others screamed so loudly that the sound echoed through the entire block. Police officers struggled to control the crowds as young fans tried to push toward the entrance. Reporters who witnessed the scene struggled to describe it. They eventually created a new term for the phenomenon, Bobby Soxers, referring to the teenage girls who wore short socks and worshiped Sinatra like a national hero. For many historians, this moment represented the birth of modern pop fandom. Long before Elvis Presley or the Beatles triggered similar reactions, Frank Sinatra had already demonstrated how powerful the emotional bond between performer and an audience could become. The attention turned Sinatra into something far bigger than a successful singer. He became a cultural symbol. Magazines printed his photograph on their covers. Radio stations competed to broadcast his newest recordings. Hollywood producers quickly realized his popularity could translate to film audiences as well. By the mid-1940s, Sinatra had begun appearing in movies, often cast as a sensitive romantic figure whose voice carried the emotional center of the story, behind the glamour. However, life at the top of the entertainment world was not as stable as it appeared. Fame at that scale created constant pressure. Sinatra was touring relentlessly, recording frequently, and appearing in films at the same time. The schedule alone would have been exhausting for anyone, but for Sinatra, the pressure extended beyond work. His personal life was increasingly becoming public entertainment for the media. Newspapers followed his relationships closely, and rumors about his marriage began circulating widely. At the same time, the music industry itself was beginning to shift. The big band era that had dominated American music throughout the 1930s and early 1940s was slowly changing. Audiences were becoming interested in new sounds and different performers. Younger singers were appearing on radio programs, and musical tastes were evolving faster than many established artists realized. Even Sinatra's voice would begin to change slightly as he aged and pushed his vocal limits through constant performances. Subtle strain began appearing during certain recordings. Most listeners did not notice it yet, but the signs were there. Still, from the outside, Sinatra appeared untouchable. By the late 1940s, he had sold millions of records, starred in successful films, and become the most recognizable voice in American popular music. Crowds still gathered wherever he performed. Studio executives still believed his name could draw audiences. Fans still wrote thousands of letters every week. Yet the very forces that had lifted Sinatra so quickly were now beginning to turn against him. Public fascination with his private life was intensifying. His marriage was under pressure, and the entertainment industry that had embraced him so enthusiastically was quietly preparing to move on to the next new sensation. The stage lights were still bright, and the applause was still loud, but the first cracks in Sinatra's empire had already begun to form. The real question was no longer how high Sinatra could climb. It was how far he might fall once the spotlight started to fade. The fall of Frank Sinatra did not happen overnight. It began quietly, almost invisibly, behind the same bright spotlight that had turned him into America's most adored voice. By the late 1940s, the public still saw the confident performer standing in front of orchestras and microphones. But inside Sinatra's life, something far more unstable was unfolding. The most dramatic shift began with a woman. Her name was Ava Gardner. When Sinatra met Gardner in the mid-1940s, she was already one of Hollywood's most striking stars. Ava Gardner had a reputation that matched her beauty: fearless, unpredictable, and emotionally intense. Where Sinatra often appeared sensitive and controlled in public, Gardner radiated a kind of wild independence that fascinated him immediately. Their attraction was explosive. At the time, Sinatra was still married to his first wife, Nancy Barbato, with whom he had 3 children. But the relationship with Gardner quickly became impossible to hide. Hollywood gossip columns began publishing rumors about their meetings, their arguments, and the intensity of their connection. Soon the rumors became public scandal. The affair placed Sinatra under enormous scrutiny. Newspapers followed his every move. Photographers waited outside restaurants and studios. His private life, once protected by the studio system, suddenly became a constant source of headlines. Eventually, Sinatra made the decision that shocked many of his fans. He left his wife and formally pursued a relationship with Ava Gardner. The two married in 1951. But if Sinatra believed marriage would calm the storm, he was wrong. Their relationship became even more volatile after the wedding. Gardner was fiercely independent and unwilling to play the role of the quiet Hollywood spouse. Arguments between them were legendary. Friends described scenes where shouting matches could last for hours. At times they separated, only to reconcile again days later. The emotional instability of the marriage began affecting Sinatra deeply. He was already under pressure from the public eye, and now his personal life had become a battlefield. Yet the chaos in his private life was only one part of crisis. At the same time, the music industry was beginning to change in ways Sinatra could not control. During the war years, his gentle romantic style had dominated radio, but by the early 1950s, audiences were moving toward new sounds and younger performers. The big band era was fading. Dance music was shifting. Record companies were investing in different voices. Slowly but unmistakably, Sinatra's dominance began to weaken. The decline became visible in record sales first. New releases that once would have topped charts now struggled to attract attention. Radio stations played his music less frequently. Concert crowds were smaller than they had been just a few years earlier. The change was subtle at first, but Sinatra could feel it. Then came the most devastating blow of all. In 1950, Sinatra suffered a serious vocal injury. During a performance, he experienced hemorrhaging in his vocal cords. For a singer whose entire identity depended on his voice, the damage was terrifying. Doctors ordered him to rest and avoid heavy singing for long periods of time. For Sinatra, that was almost impossible. Performing was not just his career, it was his entire sense of self. Yet every attempt to push his voice too far risked permanent damage. Record producers began to worry. Studio executives became cautious. The once unstoppable voice of Frank Sinatra suddenly sounded fragile. Soon the business consequences followed. Columbia Records, the label that had supported him through his rise to fame, chose not to renew his contract. Without a recording deal, Sinatra lost the most important channel for keeping his music in front of the public. Hollywood studios also began distancing themselves. The film roles that had once arrived easily now disappeared. Executives believed audiences were losing interest. Within a short period of time, Sinatra's career seemed collapsed from multiple directions at once. No record contract, no film offers, a damaged voice, and a marriage filled with conflict. For a man who had been at the center of American entertainment only a few years earlier, the contrast was devastating. The press noticed the shift immediately. Gossip columnists who had once praised him now described his decline openly. Some journalists wrote that Sinatra's era had ended. Others suggested that his fame had simply been a temporary phenomenon created by wartime emotion. One headline summarized the mood brutally: "Sinatra is finished." For Sinatra, those words were more than criticism. They felt like a public verdict on his entire life. Friends later described him during this period as deeply depressed. He drank heavily. His temper became unpredictable. Some nights he disappeared from social circles entirely, refusing to answer phone calls or invitations. The situation with Ava Gardner only intensified his emotional turmoil. Their marriage continued swinging between passion and destruction. They loved each other intensely, yet neither seemed able to bring stability to the relationship. When they argued, the fights could become explosive. At times, Sinatra appeared almost consumed by the chaos surrounding him. This was the period when one of the darkest stories of his life emerged. According to people close to him, Sinatra once sat alone in his car late at night in Los Angeles, overwhelmed by despair. He started the engine inside a closed garage and remained there as the exhaust fumes began filling the space. Carbon monoxide poisoning can quietly put a person to sleep without warning. In that moment, Sinatra was dangerously close to ending his own life. Something changed his mind. Some say it was a sudden moment of clarity. Others believe someone discovered him before the situation became fatal. The exact details remain uncertain. What is clear is that Sinatra stepped away from that moment alive, but emotionally shattered. For the public, however, the story unfolding in the newspapers was much simpler. Frank Sinatra had lost his voice. Frank Sinatra had lost his record deal. Frank Sinatra had lost his audience. The man who once caused thousands of fans to faint outside the Paramount Theater was now watching his career disappear. In the ruthless world of entertainment, fame rarely waits for anyone to recover. But Sinatra was not ready to disappear quietly. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion, the anger, and the heartbreak, The determination that had carried him out of Hoboken decades earlier was still alive, and that stubborn refusal to accept defeat would soon push Sinatra toward the opportunity that would change everything again. Because just when Hollywood believed his story was over, one unexpected film role was about to open a door no one thought he could walk through anymore. By 1952, Frank Sinatra's career looked almost irreparable. Record labels had walked away. Film studios had stopped calling. Concert bookings were inconsistent, and the once unstoppable momentum of the 1940s had vanished. In the ruthless rhythm of the entertainment industry, artists who lost public attention rarely returned to the top. Most faded quietly into nostalgia. Sinatra understood that reality better than anyone, yet he refused to accept it. Around that time, Hollywood was preparing a film adaptation of James Jones's novel From Here to Eternity. The story was set in the U.S. Army before the attack on Pearl Harbor and included a small but emotionally intense role, Private Angelo Maggio. The character was rebellious, vulnerable, and explosive at the same time. It was not a glamorous role, and it certainly was not written for a fading pop singer. But Sinatra saw something different. He believed Maggio could show the world a side of him that audiences had never seen. The problem was that almost no one in Hollywood believed he could handle the role. Studio executives remembered the charming singer from romantic musicals, not a dramatic actor capable of carrying heavy emotional scenes. Many producers assumed Sinatra's acting career was already over. Still, Sinatra pursued the part relentlessly. He called producers. He asked friends to speak on his behalf. He argued that he understood the character in a way few actors could. Maggio was impulsive, wounded, and defiant, traits Sinatra himself knew intimately after the previous years of personal turmoil. Eventually, after months of pressure and persuasion, Sinatra was allowed to audition. When the film was finally released in 1953, the results shocked many critics. Sinatra's performance as Angelo Maggio was raw and unpredictable. Instead of playing the role safely, he leaned into the character's volatility and vulnerability. The rebellious soldier on screen did not resemble the polished pop idol audiences remembered from the 1940s. The performance felt real. Viewers suddenly saw Sinatra not just as a singer, but as a dramatic actor capable of genuine intensity. Reviewers who had once dismissed him began writing about his emotional depth. The transformation was impossible to ignore. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1954, Frank Sinatra won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. The same industry that had recently declared him finished was now applauding him on one of the biggest stages in entertainment. The Oscar did more than validate a single performance. It restored Sinatra's credibility across Hollywood and the music industry. Opportunities returned almost immediately. Record companies once again wanted his voice. Film producers began offering new roles. But Sinatra did not simply resume his old career. The years of collapse had changed him, and the music he created afterward reflected that change. Soon after the Oscar victory, Sinatra signed a new recording contract with Capitol Records. The partnership would lead to some of the most influential albums of his entire career. Instead of youthful love songs, he began recording darker, more reflective material. Albums like In the Wee Small Hours and Only the Lonely explored themes of heartbreak, regret, and loneliness with a depth that few popular singers had attempted before. The shift worked. Audiences who had once adored the romantic idol of the 1940s were now listening to a different Sinatra, a man who had experienced failure and returned with something more honest to say. The emotional maturity in those recordings transformed his reputation from pop sensation to serious musical interpreter. Within only a few years, Sinatra had achieved something almost unheard of in show business. He had not simply recovered from collapse. He had reinvented himself. But the second act of Sinatra's life would not be defined only by music or film. As the 1950s ended and the 1960s began, he would step into an even larger role, one that placed him at the center of power, celebrity, and cultural influence in America. And this time, Frank Sinatra was not just returning as a performer. He was returning as the man who controlled the room. The Oscar in 1954 did more than rescue Frank Sinatra's career. It opened the door to the most powerful phase of his life. During the second half of the 1950s and into the 1960s, Sinatra was no longer just a successful singer or actor. He became something much larger inside American entertainment. A central figure who seemed to sit at the intersection of music, film, nightlife, and influence. One of the most important moves he made after the Oscar was signing with Capitol Records. The recordings he created there changed the way popular vocal albums were produced. Instead of releasing isolated hit singles, Sinatra began recording concept albums built around emotional themes. In the Wee Small Hours in 1955 explored loneliness and late-night heartbreak with an atmosphere that felt almost cinematic. Later albums such as Song for Swingin' Lovers and Only the Lonely continued shaping that idea, proving that a pop singer could present an entire emotional narrative across an album. Critics and musicians alike began to see Sinatra differently. His phrasing, timing, and subtle control of emotion became a model for future vocalists. Singers who followed in later decades, from Tony Bennett to Michael Bublé, would often describe Sinatra as the artist who showed them how a song could be interpreted rather than simply performed. At the same time, Sinatra was building influence outside the recording studio. In Las Vegas, he became the unofficial leader of a group that would soon become legendary, the Rat Pack. Alongside Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, Sinatra transformed the Las Vegas stage into a mixture of music, comedy, and improvisation. Their shows blurred the line between performance and conversation. The audience felt as if they were watching friends entertaining each other, rather than actors following a script. During the early 1960s, the Rat Pack symbolized a certain version of American glamour. The group appeared in films like Ocean's 11, performed together in casinos, and attracted constant media attention. Sinatra stood at the center of it all. By then, he was not just a performer, but a man with connections across politics, entertainment, and business. His influence reached far beyond the microphone, yet the most lasting part of Sinatra's legacy remained his voice. Over the course of his life, he recorded more than 1,000 songs and sold well over 150 million records worldwide. The style he developed, conversational phrasing, precise timing, emotional restraint, helped define the modern standard for pop and jazz vocal performance. Even as musical trends shifted in later decades, Sinatra continued performing. His concerts in the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s still drew massive audiences who wanted to hear the voice that had once shaped an entire era of American culture. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Sinatra's story was not the fame itself. It was the fact that the career dominating Las Vegas and recording studios in the 1960s and beyond had nearly disappeared completely just a few years earlier. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What would the history of American music look like if Frank Sinatra had truly vanished during that moment when the world believed his career was finished? Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, at the age of 82. By the time he passed away, he had lived through one of the most unusual careers in entertainment history. Given the first modern pop idol in the 1940s, the fallen star of the early 1950s, the Oscar-winning comeback story in 1954, and later the commanding figure who defined Las Vegas nightlife and vocal jazz for decades. More than 150 million records carried his voice across the world. Yet numbers alone cannot fully explain Sinatra's place in cultural history. What truly defined him was his ability to turn personal experience into sound. When Sinatra sang about love, loss, regret, or late-night loneliness, audiences believed him. By the time he recorded the most famous songs of his later career, he was no longer just performing lyrics. He was translating the scars of his own life. Perhaps that is why his music still resonates long after the era that created it has faded. Sinatra's recordings carry the sound of a man who experienced both extreme admiration and devastating rejection, and who managed to return from that rejection stronger than before. The night he sat alone in a car filled with exhaust fumes could easily have ended everything. A different decision in that moment might have erased the second half of his life entirely. Instead, Frank Sinatra walked away from that darkness and rebuilt himself. And that may be the quiet truth behind the legend. Even the most celebrated voice in America once stood on the edge of silence, and somehow chose to sing again.